Hello, and thank you very much for coming along to EcoViews and News once again. Today we're going to look a little bit further in depth at this question of the Green Revolution and its legacies. Norman Borlaug, as we mentioned last time, is a major figure in this, and he helped launch a whole new approach to agriculture that's dominated, both government circles and private circles for the last 50 years or so. But like all major revolutions, this one has problems. It displaces a lot of things and a lot of people. And in a sense, the long-term impact of this is now becoming visible to the world at large, even though it's taken us quite a while to see it. And so what we want to look at is, in effect, the change that's occurred. One might call it the paradigm shift, and it's not fully achieved. This is a debate that's going on. You'll hear it in the newspapers and on the various kinds of media. This is a struggle, and it's a struggle between two different ways of looking at the world. A petro-intensive, more, bigger, better logic of growth economics, and one that's focused much more on the science of ecology, that is, figuring out how to work agriculture within the agro-ecosystems of a functioning planet, continuing to depend upon the only throughput source of energy, not the fossil fuels, but what the fossil fuels represent in some sense. They are the archaeological residue, the geologic residue of former photosynthetic process. So in a sense, we have to move beyond fossil fuel agriculture and reinstitute solar sustainable agriculture if we want to exist as a species very much longer in an agricultural civilization. And of course, there's no such thing as a post-agricultural civilization. So the transition is really quite clear, and the current paradigm shift is underway as a debate beyond the Green Revolution, the current paradigm shift. We'll look at it here in terms of the Food Matter TV series that has begun, and we'll try to add a little bit more to what we looked at last time. You'll see the headlines in every newspaper as it goes forward. It's called sort of the struggle to feed itself. The world is struggling to feed itself, especially a warming world. That is a world that's experiencing global warming and climate shift. Current modes of production in areas that have been heavily dependent, for example, on irrigation or on certain patterns of rainfall are changing rapidly. So we're struggling to figure out how to feed ourselves in that context. And it's in that tradition that Norman Borlaug's contribution has been so important. But as we looked at last time, feeding hunger may just be fueling collapse, and there's a kind of multiple aspect to the legacies of the Green Revolution that have to be kept in mind. He only died a few years ago, and he was a dominant figure for most of a century. He was born in 1914, died in 2009, and he was 95 years old. And ever since he was a teenager, he was very involved in trying to focus his attention on how to change American agriculture. The trouble is the changes are now having ecological impacts, the changes that he and his followers, one might say his disciples, but it's more accurate to say his intellectual heirs and followers, promoted a heavily petro-intensive agriculture with lots of application of fertilizers and pesticides, and the reorganization of surface water into irrigation systems. But these have had costs, some of them which we're just beginning to monitor. Now, a group of scientists monitored this recently and has put some critique together. Take a look.
The planet more in the last half a century than at any time in history. Vast tracts of land have been taken for modern farming. Fertilizer use has increased hugely. Forests and other ecosystems are disappearing. None of this is a surprise, but what the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment aims to do is to measure what these environmental changes mean for human progress.
Now, that was referred to there by the reporter. The Millennial Ecosystem Assessment Report was put together by years and years of collaboration of thousands of scientists all over the world. And it was published in 2005, 4 years before Borlaug died. This is just at the end of his life. And all of these scientists from all over the world, convened by the UN, are doing an ecosystems assessment of basically our future prospects. And it's not altogether encouraging in terms of the directions in which our agriculture is moving. Take a look.
It concludes that in places too much water is being used for irrigation, so there's less available for drinking. Land that's farmed too intensively is becoming barren. Deforestation is increasing the risk of diseases such as malaria and cholera. The report also tries to put an economic cost on environmental degradation. In the UK, it finds farming causes around £1.5 billion worth of damage each year through.
Well, that's important to focus on for the BBC. In the UK, he says, it has this kind of impact. £1.5 billion a year have been, in effect, externalized by the agribusiness firms and shoved onto the public coffers, the soil erosion and things like this that he mentions. Those are problems that this intensive agriculture creates, but it doesn't pay for itself internally. And so there are externalities that have to be paid for, usually by the taxpayer, in whatever country this occurs. Take a look at the list, though, that he puts forward.
Impacts like greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution and soil erosion. Launched 4 years ago by UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is one of the biggest scientific collaborations ever undertaken. More than 2,500 pages long, the report is unlikely to produce any quick-fix solutions, but it should provide the best view yet of the problem. Richard Black, BBC News.
Okay, Richard Black carried that report back in 2005. It's the largest, actually it's 2006 that we reported on. It was on the March 30th, 2005 that Richard Black carried the report. 2,500-page report that took 4 years to put together. Now the problem was obviously, as we saw last time, that Norman Borlaug and his friends and disciples attacked the problem as if it were a food problem out there. There wasn't enough of it. It had to have more of it. And that, of course, is true. After World War II, it looked like there was a food crisis looming. But we very soon became aware that it was really better to understand the whole problem of food production as a food population crisis. That is, a food/population problem that had to be dealt with together. They had to think of ways of enabling populations to grow their own food and enable them to empower themselves. And that, in turn, especially as a result of this 2005 report that came out from the UN with 2,500 participants from all over the world, that turned out to be part of a bigger environmental problem. In other words, it's the food/population/environment problem. And this kind of recognition is something that requires a paradigm shift, because it would seem that some of the solutions that were pursued, so long as you thought it was only a food problem, are actually creating problems when it comes down to looking at it as a food, population, and environment problem. Our basic problem is that we've forgotten, and it may be said that many of our leaders never knew, the basic ecological insight of our collective niche as a species in a global ecosystem. We're not doing well, even if we're promoting our own numbers, we're not doing well in the long run by defeating or destroying either wild species or the varieties of crops that we depend on. And this has been the problem. In a way, you can see very clearly that the growth of the human population over a long period of time seemed relatively flat for a very long period of time. But when fossil fuels start to be applied to the production process, there emerges what some people call a population bomb, an explosion, really, in a very few decades or hundreds, this is 250 years, that is 250 years, we've basically been using fossil fuels, we've led to an extraordinary explosion of the human population, so much so that never before has the human population tripled in one lifetime, as it did since World War II. Human populations, those born after World War II, have witnessed populations go from a little over 2 billion on a global scale to now over 6 billion. In their lifetimes, it's been a tripling of population. And that won't happen again. It won't happen again because you can't go from 6 billion to 18 billion on the current surface of the Earth. There isn't enough surface to support 18 billion. Now, one of the problems then is that during this period, a lot of people, a lot of governments, nation states, in fact the entire FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, all of the major players in food production have been students of or followers of Norman Borlaug's path-breaking work in applying petrochemicals to agriculture. But we're going to need to make a paradigm shift very quickly away from fossil fuels if we expect to live for very long. So I've put the question in these terms, and it's pretty simply stated. Will the students and followers of Norman Borlaug be able to make the paradigm shift to sustainable agriculture? That shift which is needed and required for our collective human survival. Well, add to the question of whether they're going to be able to do it, the urgency of whether they're going to be able to do it on time, in the time we have remaining. It's not really clear. If they cannot make this needed paradigm shift, if we cannot collectively make that shift, let's not just blame this on some other people, right? This is us. This is the human enterprise. We need collectively to shift. Then we can expect some very rude and costly disruptions in the global food system in the very near future. And the reason for that is pretty simple. You can see it in the graph laid out here. We're in effect in a threefold crisis at this point. And you can look at this graph in terms of the quadrants being 25-year periods. 1900 to the year 1925, 1950, 1975, and then from 1975 to the year 2000, and this is beyond 2000. Well, these are the three interacting crises that are emerging. We're not running out of oil, but we're running out of cheap oil. That is to say, that we're reaching a peak in production. Yes, there will be more in the ground, but there'll be less and less of it each increment in time as we go forward. And that means that its price is going to go skyrocketing through the roof. At the same time, our population is continuing to increase in this kind of J-shaped pattern. It's called a positive growth rate and exponential growth. Okay, the oil is plateauing out and beginning to decline, population still continuing, and the third element here on this graph is that we have planetary temperature building up at the same time. Now, if you look at this as a dynamic process, you can see we're up against some real problems of time constraint. 25 years, 25 years, 25 years, and we're just at the end of this 25 years over into this territory over here, past the year 2000. Well, our oil has begun to decline, and our population continues to increase, and the global temperature is going skyrocketing beyond any recorded temperature in human history as a global average. Well, this is a crisis. So if we don't learn how to, in effect, get our whole production system off this resource, which is inevitably going to decline, we're not only going to experience enormous surges in temperature, the population itself will crash. Now, people have been pointing this out for a while. This is not a brand new insight, and we ought to listen to some of them, especially the scientists who are making this case from positions in the third world.
Bringing the people behind our food to life.
The myth of genetic engineering that's been put out in terms of saying this is the solution to hunger is a totally false myth. because there are only two applications that have been commercialized in these 20 years of genetic engineering. One is to make seeds more resilient to herbicides, which means you get to spread more Roundup, you get to spread more glyphosate, and you get to spread more poison. Not a very desirable trait in farming systems, especially since what Monsanto will call weeds are actually alternative sources of food. For example, in India, Monsanto had ads selling Roundup with weeds around a woman's hands saying, "Liberate yourself." But what Monsanto calls weeds is food for the cattle, it's greens for the family, it's medicinal plants. And the spraying of Roundup is like an ecocide of the planet, destroying diversity. The other brand of genetic engineering is Bt toxin crops. You take a genetically engineered toxin from a bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis, which is why Bt, put it into the plant, and now this toxin is a ready-made toxin, different from the bacteria where it becomes a toxin in the gut of particular insects and therefore only targets the caterpillars. This ready-made toxin now starts to affect butterflies and bees. A Cornell study showed that butterflies fed with pollen from Bt corn had a much higher level of mortality. We've just done a recent study that's showing that soils with Bt cotton have lost nearly 30% of the soil microorganism within 3 years of cultivation. There are reports in India of cattle dying after grazing on Bt cotton fields because, after all, it's a toxin. And if this is happening to animals and bees, what's going to happen to human beings with a lifetime of feeding these toxic foods? There's also talk about producing more nutrition. A golden rice is talked about a lot. Well, golden rice has 34 micrograms of vitamin A equivalent. Real sources of vitamin A are greens. For example, the coriander leaf that we use in our curries, or the curry leaf, they have 1,400 micrograms. So a 70-fold reduction in vitamin A is sold as an increased availability of vitamin A. These are illusions that are being marketed in order for people to hand over the power to decide what we eat to a handful of corporations. This is not being done to improve the food supply or improve nutrition. It's being done to control food. Without genetic engineering, companies could not have patented seed. A seed patent means the right to exclude anyone from making, using, saving, developing the patented product. If it's a machine, it doesn't matter. If it's an aeroplane, it doesn't matter. Boeing makes aeroplane, a local citizen does not. But when it comes to seed, if Monsanto gets a patent right to seed, then a farmer saving seed is treated like a thief, an intellectual property thief. A farmer whose field is contaminated by a genetically engineered seed that Monsanto has sold through pollination or wind, that farmer who is a victim of pollution is also treated like a thief, because when seed becomes intellectual property, the existence of the genetically engineered traits anywhere without the patent holder's permission is treated like theft. This is how Percy Smicer in Canada was sued $200,000. 1,000 states have been sued by Monsanto after Monsanto contaminated their crops. This is putting the principle of the polluter pays into a principle of the polluter gets paid. So Monsanto has control over the seed through patents and then control over the rest of the food through contamination. It's a very perverse situation. It has to change. It's non-sustainable, it's unjust, it's immoral, and the fact that they got away with it for 20 years should be no reason why they should get away with it for the next 20 years.
Okay, well, you can't get a more clear indictment of some of the aspects of the Green Revolution here. I'm focusing particularly on Monsanto's activities in India. It's pretty extraordinary what Monsanto has done to both privatize crops that were publicly available, or change them slightly in the laboratory genetically, and then present them as something they own to to the population, and then engineer them in such a way that they only respond to their own herbicides, pesticides applied as a package. They'll even develop a seed that's covered with these chemicals in order just to grow that particular variety in the field. Meanwhile, in effect, treating, as she says, as outlaws anyone who grows their own material that happens to be contaminated by the pollen coming in from the genetically modified material. Well, let's take a look a little bit further, because I think the issues suggest that there's a huge paradigm shift in global agricultural science. This isn't a reaction against science. This is a fulfillment of science, an extension of science. Now, at the same time, global food supplies are becoming more and more pricey. And that seems to be a result as well of a lot of the international food trade. You can hear it on local programs here in Boston on a regular basis nowadays.
Major funding for On Point is provided by Liberty Mutual for all your auto, home, life, and business insurance needs. Liberty Mutual. Responsibility. What's your policy?
From WBUR Boston, I'm Tom Ashbrook, and this is On Point. It's an issue as old as pharaohs and famine, and as new as today's headlines from the Middle East, from Egypt. The human food supply. It's tight right now and costly. In America, that means higher prices for cornflakes or a McDonald's burger. In some parts of the world, it can mean riots or revolution. Weather, climate, surging demand, biofuels all play a part. The picture looks more and more challenging. This hour On Point, the global food squeeze of 2011. You can join the conversation. Have you noticed the headlines from China, Russia, North Africa, all over the map on the soaring price of basic foods? Is it good for you so far, your farm, your bottom line? What are family and friends overseas telling you about their food bills, their weather, their food future? You can comment at our website, onpointradio.org, or on Twitter and Facebook at onpointradio. Here's a microphone taken into a market in Hyderabad, in India. Al Jazeera English talking with a merchant saying she's taking a lot of flack from customers upset over higher prices.
Customers are complaining day in and day out. I don't know what to say to them. There was a bad crop this year and it's got too expensive, so they just walk away.
But you can only walk so far away from food. Joining us now from Washington is Gawain Kripke, Director of Policy Research with Oxfam America.
Now that's who you'd start to talk to, policy research people on food policy. And again, who do you start consulting when you look at these food riots around the world? They can actually be mapped and were in the 2007-2008 series of riots. Lester Brown, who came through here in Cambridge and gave a series of talks that were very important, has emphasized this in Scientific American recently, underscoring that he thinks we're in real trouble here. The biggest threat to global stability is the potential for food crises in poor countries to cause government collapse. Food scarcity and the resulting higher food prices are pushing poor countries into chaos, he argues. Such failed states can export disease, terrorism, illicit drugs, weapons, and refugees, is what he's emphasizing. Refugees. We're going to see this in our lap. This isn't something that is just somewhere else. This is global at this point. Water shortages, soil loss, and rising temperatures from global warming are placing severe limits on food production. Without massive and rapid intervention, he argues, a series of governmental collapses could threaten the world order. Now, this is not casual talk from one of the world's greatest experts. Failed states can export and will a whole series of things. Well, this is happening already in North Africa. We've seen it in the food riots there. Back in February of this year, Tunisian migrants started moving in a massive way towards Italy. And it's being exacerbated by the fact that we're using ethanol to fuel our cars. We'll look at those aspects of things in the future, but just to realize there is a part of a global movement now to get beyond fossil fuels. This is happening not just in agriculture, to a safer fuel. And the movement starts this week. launch it. I mean, get hold of it on the September 24th, next Saturday. See what's going to be unfolding. Thank you. See you next week.